Hollywood stars with the worst tempers of all time.
Get out! Get out! Get out! Get the f*** out!
Hollywood has always been a place where larger-than-life personalities collide with enormous pressure, massive egos, and the kind of stress that would break most ordinary people. The bright lights, the relentless public scrutiny, the creative frustrations, and the extraordinary power that fame bestows. It is a cocktail that has, time and again, transformed some of the most gifted individuals on the planet into people their closest colleagues barely recognized. Today, we are pulling back the velvet curtain on the stars whose tempers became almost as legendary as their talent. These are not rumors whispered in green rooms. These are documented incidents, court records, leaked recordings, and first-hand accounts from crew members, co-stars, publicists, and journalists who lived through the chaos. Buckle up, because what happened behind the cameras is often far more dramatic than anything that ever made it onto the screen. Christian Bale is, by almost any measure, one of the most committed and technically gifted actors of his generation. His physical transformations alone, from the skeletal frame he carried in The Machinist to the muscled bulk of Batman, speak to a level of dedication that borders on the obsessive. That obsession, it turns out, does not stay neatly contained within the borders of artistic discipline. The incident that introduced the general public to Bale's volcanic temper occurred in 2009, during the production of Terminator Salvation. What happened one afternoon on set became one of the most infamous moments in Hollywood history, not because it happened, but because it was recorded. Cinematographer Shane Hurlbut, a respected and experienced professional, inadvertently walked into Bale's eye line during the filming of an emotionally charged scene. What followed was not a quiet word of frustration, or even a sharp remark. It was an eruption. For nearly 4 minutes, Bale unleashed a tirade of extraordinary intensity, hurling profanities, threatening to quit the production entirely, and demanding that Hurlbut be removed from the film. When that recording leaked to the public, the response was immediate and electric. Radio stations remixed it to music. Late-night hosts played clips to roaring laughter. But for many people in the industry, the amusement was tinged with recognition. This was not a surprise to those who had worked with Bale before. Crew members from other productions quietly began sharing their own stories, describing an actor who held himself and everyone around him to impossibly high standards and who did not respond graciously when those standards were not met. Bale did eventually issue a public apology, but the apology came after the damage was done. The unsettling truth that the Bale incident forced into the open is this: brilliance does not excuse cruelty, even when that cruelty is directed at a professional in a moment of creative frustration. Edward Norton arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1990s trailing an almost supernatural level of critical acclaim. His debut in Primal Fear earned him an Academy Award nomination before most of the industry had even learned his name. His performance in American History X cemented his reputation as one of the finest actors of his generation. And then, slowly but unmistakably, something shifted. Norton's problem was never talent. It was control. Somewhere along the way, the perfectionism that made his performances so extraordinary began bleeding into every other aspect of production. By the time he was cast as Bruce Banner in Marvel's The Incredible Hulk in 2008, his reputation as a difficult collaborator had already hardened into something approaching industry folklore. Norton did not simply show up, learn his lines, and perform. He inserted himself into the writing process without invitation, demanding extensive rewrites of scenes he had not been hired to write. He pushed back against the director's creative decisions in ways that went far beyond the normal actor-director conversation. He advocated for final cut privileges, a rare concession even for the most powerful stars in the industry. When Marvel Studios decided not to bring Norton back for the Avengers, Kevin Feige's official statement was diplomatically worded but unmistakably pointed. The studio wanted someone who embodies the collaborative spirit of our ensemble. The industry knew exactly what that meant. During the production of American History X, Norton's battles with director Tony Kaye became so intense and so bitter that Kaye ultimately attempted to have his own name removed from the film entirely. What makes Norton's story genuinely interesting rather than simply cautionary is the complexity underneath it. His problem is not rage or contempt but rather an unshakable conviction that he knows best, about stories, about characters, about film. That conviction has occasionally produced extraordinary results. It has also left a trail of strained relationships and wary studios that have quietly declined to cast him in projects where collaborative trust is essential. There is a particular irony in the fact that Russell Crowe's defining role, the one that won him the Academy Award and placed him among the very highest tier of Hollywood stars, was about a man who fought for his survival in brutal, unforgiving circumstances. The irony is that Crowe did not need a script to access that combative energy. He brought it with him everywhere he went. During the production of Gladiator itself, the stories were already circulating. Crowe's demands on set were legendary in their scope and intensity. Food that did not meet his standards meant a work stoppage. Lines he did not approve of meant rewrites delivered not as requests but as ultimatums. Director Ridley Scott reportedly developed specific management strategies simply to keep Crowe engaged and on set. The most documented of Crowe's explosions occurred not on a film set, but in a New York hotel in 2005. Unable to get a phone call through to his wife, Crowe took the telephone physically and threw it at a hotel concierge named Nestor Estrada, striking the man in the face. Crowe was arrested and charged with assault. He was photographed in handcuffs. The concierge required medical attention. There was no ambiguity about what had happened, and there was no method-acting defense available. The incident was remarkable not because it was an aberration but because it was so thoroughly consistent with what people in the industry had been observing for years. Insurance companies had already begun requiring special contractual provisions for productions involving Crowe, a remarkable development that speaks to how thoroughly his reputation had penetrated the business infrastructure of Hollywood. And yet, the same explosive temperament that caused so many people so much distress was, in some alchemical and deeply uncomfortable way, connected to what made Crowe so compelling to watch on screen. Sean Penn has spent decades occupying one of Hollywood's most paradoxical positions, universally acknowledged as a performer of rare and stunning ability, and simultaneously associated with a pattern of behavior that has, at various points, resulted in criminal charges, public humiliation, and genuine fear in the people around him. Penn's relationship with the paparazzi became the defining public dimension of his temper during the 1980s, when his high-profile marriage to Madonna transformed him into one of the most photographed people on earth. His response to photographers was not the stony silence or pained smile that most celebrities eventually learned to deploy. It was physical. Several of those incidents passed through the legal system. An attack on a photographer on a film set earned Penn 33 days in jail. But Penn's anger was not reserved exclusively for the press. On the set of Casualties of War, Penn's method approach apparently extended beyond the camera's view. According to accounts from the production, Penn maintained his character's hostility toward co-star Michael J. Fox throughout filming, addressing Fox by his character's name and delivering whispered insults between takes. The line between performance and personal aggression was apparently not a line Penn considered particularly meaningful. What is genuinely striking about Penn's trajectory is how comprehensively the industry chose to reframe his behavior as his career matured. The same qualities described in the 1980s as a dangerous and uncontrolled temper were, by the 2000s, being discussed as intensity, commitment, and passion. His Academy Award wins completed a transformation in narrative that left many of his earlier targets understandably bewildered. Now we arrive at number 3, and this one is genuinely shocking. Chevy Chase was, for a brief and brilliant period in the mid to late 1970s, arguably the funniest person in America. His work on the original cast of Saturday Night Live established him as a major comic talent, and his film career, particularly the Vacation franchise, cemented a bond with mainstream audiences that seemed unbreakable. What unraveled that bond was not a single dramatic incident, but rather decades of behavior so consistently harmful and so thoroughly documented that it eventually became impossible to ignore. The stories from SNL are the foundation. Chase's treatment of his fellow cast members was, by many accounts, genuinely cruel, not the rough humor of comedians working through material, but targeted, mean-spirited attacks designed to diminish and humiliate. His relationship with Bill Murray was so hostile that it escalated to a physical altercation backstage. He reportedly made racially charged comments to colleagues that had no comedic justification whatsoever. But the Community years represent the most thoroughly documented chapter of Chase's conduct. The NBC sitcom became a battleground partly because of his behavior on set. He reportedly made racist remarks about cast members including Donald Glover, walked off set when displeased with his material, and his use of a specific racial slur during a dispute about his character, an incident serious enough to halt production temporarily, represented a level of behavior that could not be reframed as mere eccentricity. What makes Chase's story particularly instructive is the consequence. Unlike some performers whose difficult reputations coexist with thriving careers, Chase's behavior ultimately did what the entertainment industry rarely allows bad behavior to do. It ended his relevance entirely. The talent that had once made the behavior tolerable was no longer sufficient cover. Faye Dunaway is, by any serious assessment of her body of work, one of the genuinely great actresses of the 20th century. Her performances in Bonnie and Clyde, Chinatown, and Network constitute a triptych of cinematic brilliance that few actors of any era could match. What is equally beyond serious dispute, unfortunately, is the reality of her behavior on and off set, which became so extreme in certain instances that it tested the limits of what even Hollywood was willing to absorb. The most dramatic single incident in Dunaway's professional life occurred not on a film set but in a theatrical production. When she was cast in the Los Angeles production of Sunset Boulevard in 1994, the tantrums during rehearsals were reported as extreme, the treatment of crew members described as demeaning and frightening. The situation ultimately became so unmanageable that Andrew Lloyd Webber made the decision to shut down the entire Los Angeles production rather than continue. Productions do not shut down easily or cheaply. The fact that it was deemed preferable to continuing with Dunaway in place speaks volumes about what those weeks of rehearsal had been like. Her film sets told similar stories. The demand that crew members not make eye contact with her was widely reported across multiple productions. Her clashes with Roman Polanski during Chinatown, a film that resulted in one of the greatest performances ever captured on camera, were described as ferocious. The uncomfortable truth at the center of Dunaway's story is one that the film industry has never satisfactorily resolved. When the results of someone's uncompromising intensity are as extraordinary as hers were, what is the appropriate calculus for the people who absorb the damage? Any honest accounting of Hollywood's most extreme temperaments must eventually arrive at Klaus Kinski, at which point the stories from every other entry on this list begin to seem almost reasonable by comparison. Kinski was not difficult in the way that most difficult actors are difficult. He was, by the accounts of those who worked most closely with him, operating in a register of behavior that went beyond professional dysfunction into something that more closely resembled genuine psychological crisis made visible. His collaboration with German director Werner Herzog produced some of the most remarkable films of the 1970s and 1980s, Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Nosferatu, and Fitzcarraldo among them. These are films of extraordinary power, and Kinski's performances at their center are unlike anything else in the history of cinema. They are also films that were made under conditions that, by contemporary standards, would be considered completely unacceptable. During the filming of Aguirre in the Peruvian jungle, Kinski's rages became so severe that they constituted a genuine threat to the safety of those around him. He fired a weapon at crew members who were making noise in their accommodation, and a man lost part of a finger as a result. Herzog, in his documentary My Best Fiend, confirmed that indigenous extras on the production approached him with an offer to kill Kinski if Herzog wished. Herzog has acknowledged that he seriously considered the offer before declining. On Fitzcarraldo, Kinski's explosions were daily occurrences. During one outburst, he struck a local extra with a sword, causing a wound serious enough to require immediate medical attention. What separates Kinski from every other entry on this list is his complete and apparently sincere lack of interest in concealing or apologizing for any of it. His autobiography reads as an enthusiastic self-portrait of a man who considered conventional behavior entirely beneath him. Alec Baldwin's career is one of the more complicated case studies in the relationship between extraordinary ability and the management of a volatile temperament. At his best, on 30 Rock, in Glengarry Glen Ross, he is one of the most compelling screen presences of his generation. The other side of that ledger is also thoroughly documented. In 2007, a voicemail he left for his young daughter, which he did not intend to become public but which did, revealed a level of rage directed at an 11-year-old child that shocked even people accustomed to Hollywood's extremes. Other incidents followed with enough regularity to constitute a pattern rather than a series of isolated lapses. A confrontation with airline flight crew resulted in his removal from a flight and a temporary ban from the carrier. An alleged physical altercation with a photographer over a parking dispute in Manhattan resulted in an arrest. A confrontation involving the use of homophobic slurs resulted in the cancellation of a television project he had recently launched. Baldwin has been more publicly candid about his anger than almost anyone else on this list. He has described it as a serious problem, acknowledged seeking help for it on multiple occasions, and expressed what has appeared to be genuine remorse. The gap between that self-awareness and the continuation of the incidents is significant, and honest people find it difficult to explain. Tommy Lee Jones has built a reputation over decades as one of Hollywood's most formidable and intimidating presences through a mechanism that is in some ways more effective than rage. Pure, glacial contempt delivered with the confidence of a man who has decided that most of the people around him are simply not worth his full attention. Jim Carrey, during the production of Batman Forever, described being told directly by Jones that he could not sanction his co-star's approach to the role. On Men in Black, Jones's notoriously cool treatment of Will Smith, one of the most universally liked performers in the industry, became something that director Barry Sonnenfeld reportedly had to actively manage throughout production. What Jones has perfected is the art of expressing displeasure without raising his voice. Journalists who have covered his press tours describe elaborate pre-interview briefings from publicists, warning them away from entire categories of questions that Jones considers beneath his engagement. When a reporter crosses into territory Jones deems unsuitable, the response is not anger but something that can feel worse: a long, measured look, a clipped response, and the unmistakable communication that the questioner has revealed themselves to be exactly as foolish as Jones suspected. Directors cast him anyway, and the reason is evident on screen. When Jones commits to a performance, the results are remarkable, precise, authoritative, and completely inhabited. What connects all of these stories, across decades and genres and wildly different personalities, is a single uncomfortable tension that Hollywood has never resolved and perhaps never will. The industry runs on talent. Extraordinary talent is rare enough that the people who possess it are granted privileges and latitude that bear almost no relationship to what ordinary professional standards would permit. And the people who are harmed by the exercise of that privilege, the crew members, the co-stars, the assistants, the hotel staff, the photographers, rarely have the platform or the power to make their experiences part of the official record. Some of the performers on this list have grown, acknowledged their behavior, and made genuine efforts to change. Others have continued as they always were, protected by their commercial value and the industry's reflexive willingness to absorb almost any amount of personal misconduct in exchange for what happens when the camera rolls. The stories themselves, however startling, are ultimately less interesting than what they reveal about the structures that made them possible. The silence of crew members under contract, the incentive studios have to protect their investments over their people, and the cultural mythology that has long insisted, against considerable evidence, that being difficult and being great are somehow connected. They are not. And the ones who couldn't separate the two deserve to be remembered clearly and completely for both.